In the year 260 AD, a terrible event in Rome's history occurred. That year, the Emperor Valerian, ruler of the greatest empire in the world, lost the Battle of Edessa near the modern-day border between Syria and Turkey to the Persians of the east and was taken captive by King Shapur of Persia. Nobody is quite sure what happened to him afterwards, though they all tend to agree that things didn't turn out so good for Valerian. One version has it that Valerian was brought out to be used as a mounting block for Shapur when he was mounting his horse, a kind of footstool. Another contends that Shapur forced him to drink molten gold. All agree that he died within a few months of becoming a captive of the Persians, generally after suffering some species of torture or humiliation. The whole shoddy episode emphasizes one thing: it was not always good to be the Roman emperor. Indeed, while Valerian's story is particularly unpleasant, far more Roman emperors died at the hands of rivals or under violent circumstances than is normally appreciated. So being a Roman emperor often sucked, rather than it being a great thing as we explore here. Of course, there weren't always Roman emperors during Rome's history. The first emperor did not arrive on the scene until 27 BC, and even when he did, he tried to disguise the fact that he was even an emperor. Octavian, the future Emperor Caesar Augustus, was the grandnephew and adopted heir of Julius Caesar. He emerged victorious out of the civil war between himself and Mark Antony that followed Caesar's assassination by a cohort of Roman senators in 44 BC. Octavian then later convinced the Senate to bestow an unusual set of powers on him in 27 BC that made him the princeps, or first citizen, of Rome. One of the titles he adopted was that of imperator, meaning conqueror or commander, a title which many Roman generals had been given in the past. Today, it is anglicized as emperor. This mass of new titles and powers is seen as establishing the imperial title, though Octavian, who now adopted the name Caesar Augustus, meaning revered Caesar, would pass these honors on to his successors. So with this, great riches followed, and power in Rome's empire was now firmly split between the Senate and the emperors. For instance, the Roman provinces were divided up into senatorial provinces and imperial provinces, with the emperors having control over the administration and finances of the imperial provinces. The emperors also were the de facto commanders-in-chief of the Roman military, which otherwise did not have a centralized staff office. Given all of this, the emperors were immensely powerful, the most powerful human beings on Earth in their time. Therefore, it maybe seems a bit far-fetched to say that life sucked for them. But, as we will now see, a very high proportion of them met with a terrible end or had a short reign, even if things didn't work out as badly as they had for Valerian. Few dynasties amongst the Roman emperors emphasized the different fortunes that emperors could experience than the JulioClaudians. This was the family of Julius Caesar and Caesar Augustus. There were 5 JulioClaudian emperors. Caesar Augustus ruled for just over 40 years between 27 BC and 14 AD in what was one of the longest reigns in Roman imperial history. He was followed by his stepson Tiberius, who reigned for 23 years down to 37 AD. His young cousin Caligula then managed just 4 years on the throne to 41 AD, followed by Claudius's 13-year reign and Nero's reign of 14 years. The Julio-Claudian dynasty came to an end in 68 AD. Of these 5 rulers, 2 were effectively overthrown. Caligula was killed by the Praetorian Guard in 41 AD after a 4-year reign of terror. Nero was overthrown in 68 AD and took his own life after fleeing from Rome. It is also speculated that Claudius was poisoned in 54 AD. And also, Tiberius was not exactly well-liked. The head of the Praetorian Guard during his reign, Sejanus, tried to usurp his power while Tiberius lived in exile from Rome at his island villa on Capri. For sure, these men were immensely wealthy and powerful in their own ways, but only Caesar Augustus was a well-liked ruler, and several of his successors were so unpopular that they were killed or overthrown. There were periods in which it appears to have genuinely been a great thing to have been a Roman emperor. The foremost such period was during the 2nd century AD, in the era of the rulers known as the Five Good Emperors. These were Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius. Ruling consecutively between 96 AD and 180 AD, these 5 rulers presided over an unprecedented period of peace and prosperity. Trajan extended the Roman Empire to its greatest extent, conquering Dacia in what is now Romania, annexing the Nabatean kingdom in Jordan, and engaging in a military campaign against the Parthian Empire in which he briefly conquered Mesopotamia in what is now Iraq. During Hadrian's reign, things were so settled that he became known for touring the empire and engaging in administrative reforms, most famously the construction of a great defensive wall across northern England. None of these 5 emperors were assassinated or died under suspicious circumstances. And yet, even here there were some issues. Marcus Aurelius might be well known today for being a Stoic philosopher who wrote a series of meditations that have gained a following in modern times. This didn't stop Aurelius from developing an addiction to opium, though. Also, Hadrian's life was blighted by the premature death of his lover Antinous, and he was disliked by the Roman Senate on account of his love of Greek culture and his aloofness from the Roman elite. Worst of all, the Antonine Plague, named after Antoninus Pius, ravaged the empire in the 160s AD, killing millions of people in what was the Roman equivalent of the Black Death. Life didn't suck for the 5 good emperors, but it wasn't all rosy at the same time. Whatever difficulties the 5 good emperors experienced were minimal compared to the trials and tribulations of the emperors of the era that followed. This began in 192 AD, when Emperor Commodus, the famous tyrant who appears as Marcus Aurelius's son in the film Gladiator, was reputed to have been strangled to death by a wrestler in his bathtub. In 193 AD, things got seriously messy in Rome because no less than 5 different men were declared emperor in a single year. And in the 3rd century, the Roman Empire was plunged into an unprecedented crisis. The empire was invaded by foreign barbarians along the Rhine and Danube frontiers. Civil wars were a perennial feature of Roman life, and a terrible economic crisis led to hyperinflation. Between 235 AD and 284 AD, there were dozens of emperors who came and went. Many were acclaimed by their legions and tried to assume the imperial mantle, only to be murdered within a few months or a year or two. Some only lasted a few days. Emperor Carus, who ruled for less than a year between the autumn of 282 AD and the summer of 283 AD, was said to have been killed after being struck by lightning. More likely he was poisoned or killed by some rival. There were so many emperors who were killed within months of assuming the title of emperor during the 3rd century crisis that historians still debate the exact number who ruled during this period. So it definitely sucked to be an emperor during this period. Becoming ruler of the Roman Empire was a death sentence for many, but their vanity and thirst for power led them to quest after the title anyway. The situation stabilized in the late 3rd century AD and paved the way for the accession of the famous Emperor Constantine, the ruler who reigned between 306 AD and 337 AD, and began the process of converting the empire to Christianity. He established a dynasty that lasted for over half a century down to 363 AD. Yet that doesn't necessarily mean that the members of the dynasty all led great lives. After Constantine died in 337 AD, his sons and relatives descended into a power struggle in which brothers killed each other and internal family strife was widespread. As time went by after the dynasty of Constantine and his sons, many Roman emperors simply had very little power of any kind and were little more than stooges. Real power often lay in the hands of powerful military commanders or even Germanic warlords. Take the example of Anorius. He was a son of Emperor Theodosius I. also known as Theodosius the Great, his father had been a strong ruler who galvanized the empire after a difficult period in the 370s AD. Anorius succeeded him in 395 AD when he was just 11 years old. By then, the empire was firmly divided into a Western Roman Empire and an Eastern Roman Empire. Anorius ruled over the western half. He was no more than a stooge there. For much of his reign, real power lay in the hands of Stilicho, the son of a Germanic military officer in the employment of the Roman army. It was during Honorius's reign, in 410 AD, that Rome was sacked by a Gothic horde, an epoch-defining event in Roman history. As St. Jerome, living at the time in Bethlehem, proclaimed, "The city which had taken the whole world was itself taken." Honorius took much of the blame for this, even though he was just a puppet ruler. The same was true for many of his successors in the Western Roman Empire. When the final Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was dethroned by a Germanic warlord, Odoacer, in 476 AD, bringing the Western Roman Empire to an end, it was simply formalizing what had been the reality for many decades, that the emperors in the west of the empire were little more than stooges. This was the somewhat pathetic manner in which the imperial office died out in Italy and other parts of the Western Mediterranean world. One thing that is worth noting is that the lifestyle of the emperors could, on occasion, be quite pleasant. The emperors were the wealthiest individuals in the world in their time, and owned vast estates around Rome and Italy, with additional imperial residences emerging in the provinces over time. Take the Villa of Tiberius in Capri, for example. Perched dramatically on cliffs overlooking the Bay of Naples, this retreat was a secluded paradise, far from the political noise of Rome. Tiberius reportedly spent his later years there indulging in luxury, pleasure, and isolation. Meanwhile, Hadrian's villa in Tivoli was less a getaway and more an imperial microcosm of the empire itself. Spanning around 18 square kilometers, it included not only the essentials of Roman aristocratic life, like baths, libraries, dining halls, and gardens, but also replicas of Egyptian, Greek, and other architectural styles from lands Hadrian had visited. There was even a Nile-inspired canal known as the Canopus, named after the Egyptian city, and an artificial island known as the Maritime Theater, where the emperor could isolate himself in luxurious solitude, surrounded by art and philosophy. What's more, a Roman emperor could order a temple to be built in honor of himself in Hispania or Syria, or could order an invasion of Britain or Parthia, as rulers like Claudius and Trajan did. If he was so inclined, he could surround himself with art, luxury, and pleasure, and live a life most people could only dream of. At least that's the theory, because in reality, most Roman emperors had to deal with a lot of stress, between the borders of the empire being invaded by Germanic tribes to rivals trying to overthrow them. The majority of Roman emperors in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries AD had to deal perennially with the borders of the empire being overrun and trying to stave off the incursions of groups like the Goths, Huns, and Franks. Like, for example, the Emperor Valens was killed at the famous Battle of Adrianople near the eastern capital, Constantinople, in 378 AD, fighting a huge Gothic army. So now you should know, being a Roman emperor was not a leisurely position. In conclusion, was it good to be a Roman emperor, or did it suck for many of them? The answer really was a mixed bag. Life was good for many emperors. Nobody could realistically deny that Caesar Augustus spent much of his life ruling as a highly successful emperor satisfied with his accomplishments. Similarly, Vespasian, the founder of the short-lived Flavian dynasty in 69 AD, was a good emperor who lived a good life, as were the vast majority of the 5 good emperors, although each had their struggles, whether it was Hadrian dealing with the acrimony of the Senate, or Marcus Aurelius contending with plagues, wars, and a feckless son and heir. For others, things were far worse. Becoming emperor for a period of about 5 decades in the middle of the 3rd century almost guaranteed a person a swift death. 2 of the 5 JulioClaudian emperors ended up being ousted and dying or being killed. By the late 4th century and into the 5th, many emperors were little more than stooges of the military. Overall, more Roman emperors were overthrown, deposed, or effectively sidelined by the military than actually ruled effectively in their own rights. For rulers like Augustus, Vespasian, Trajan, or Constantine, it was good to be the emperor. But for a huge percentage of Roman emperors, it genuinely did suck to be the ruler of the Roman Empire, and could often lead to a swift death.